Hi everyone, welcome back. So I'm going to go over our basically what is due for this Milestone 3 project that we have coming up this week. So just to remind you where everything is located, if you go into the learning module and then in module 6, we have the information for this particular milestone. So we have the diversity indices that you will need, the vegetation analysis PDF, and then the graph that you completed for milestone 2. You'll also want to reference the frontiers in ecology, and then don't forget to take a look at the guidelines and rubric for milestone 3. Okay. In addition, if you need any other resources for this particular milestone, go ahead and under your learning modules, in the Start Here folder, we have the assignment guidelines and rubric where everything is located. So we have the diversity indices, the vegetation analysis, and then all of the guidelines. Okay, so and as well as that Belize map if you think you're going to need it. So those are all available under the Start Here folder. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at what is required for our, our final project here. So far, you've already completed the title, the introduction, and the methods section of your milestone, of the final project, excuse me. And then you performed the data analysis for the McKinnon data. So now we basically have everything that we need to complete this project, okay? So in this milestone, you're not going to be graded on the title, introduction, method section again, okay? But you're going to be graded on the results, the discussion section, the references, and then also your writing style, okay? So that's basically the rest of the final project rubric, okay? So once you've completed this, then you're going to basically put it all together and submit the final project next week. Okay, so let's start off and take a look at what is required for our milestone 3. So again, you're going to be submitting the results, the discussion, the literature cited, and you'll be graded on your writing. So the results section, they give a page length of about 3 pages. Again, just like in milestone 1, I'm not very particular about the page length, especially because in the results section, some of you will be including your graphs and your tables and things like that. And so that's going to make the page count a lot higher. Others put the graphs and the figures and everything at the end of their final project as an appendix. So either way works for me. But your results section will include 3 parts, okay? So you have the species diversity and abundance section or subsection, the vegetation analysis subsection, and then the diversity indices subsection. So just like in milestone 1, I suggest that you have the results as your section heading, and then you have these subheadings listed, okay? So under each subheading, we'll have a separate paragraph. So let's take a look at what should be included under the species diversity and abundance subheading. So species diversity and abundance, that was based on your McKinnon data. So we already analyzed that ourselves in milestone 2. So that is going to be included. You will want to include the species diversity and abundance graph. So that graph, again, can be included in the text, or you can include it as an appendix at the end of your paper. Either way works for me. If you're going to include it as a text, as part of the text, you can either include it, right under the subheading, or you can include it after the written paragraph. So just a reminder, when you're writing the results section, you're going to describe the results, okay? So that needs to be written, and it'll take about a paragraph to write that out. So it's not just putting a bunch of figures together, so you do need to explain the figures in detail. So this first graph will be that species diversity graph, and basically you're going to write a paragraph describing what you see, okay? So you're not going to be formulating an opinion or anything. You're just describing what you see in the graph. So I like to tell students that it's a good idea to identify the total number of species found at each site, okay, as well as the trends and data that you see. So for example, most of you, hopefully all of you, will figure out that Punta Gorda had the most number of species. And you'll notice that Gallon Jug had the least number of species. Okay, so you might want to describe the total number of species for each site, but also the trends that you see. So for example, when you compare Gallon Jug to Punta Gorda, you'll notice that the Gallon Jug, basically that the line kind of levels off after the first 10 surveys. There aren't very many species discovered after, say, survey 11. There's only a handful of species found after survey 11. So that kind of indicates that that's probably the total number of species found at that site. Whereas with Punta Gorda and Cockscomb, you can see that the line is continuing in an upward trend. So even after 14, 15 surveys, you're still finding a pretty significant number of species. So there's probably even more species to be found if we had continued doing survey 16, 17, all the way, for a while, you might continue to find new species along the way. So that's what I mean by trends and data. So take a look at those lines and see where they level off for some sites and where they continue to grow for other sites. Okay, so that should take you about one paragraph, as well as including your graph. And some of you can even include your data table if you feel like it. Okay, so the data table is welcome to be included as well. Okay, but the major pieces are the graph and the paragraph. So the next subsection in your results section will be the vegetation analysis. So if you recall from your methods section, you mentioned hopefully that we did not collect that data, right? So instead we relied on that data that was from that website. So that GIS data that was incorporated, and then basically we just used that data to create those pie charts. So you'll want to include the pie charts in your document as well. For some of you, the pie charts, it might be kind of difficult getting those pie charts into a Word document. So the way that I do that is I take a screenshot of it. So actually, let me go ahead and show you how I do it. So for those of you that have problems, so I'm just going to go ahead and click that vegetation analysis. So you're going to need to take a screenshot of this, okay? So for some of you, you've maybe never taken a screenshot before. So if you just right-click, you can take a screenshot, okay? And then you can open this in another program, such as Paint. So if I take a screenshot, I can, kind of decide how much of it I want to include, okay? And then take a screenshot. Okay, so it's really not that complicated. And then you just make sure you save this as, you can save it as an image or whatnot, and then you can go ahead and upload it into your Word document or whatever program you use for word processing. Okay, so that's how you include these. But while I have this here, in addition to these particular pie charts, and notice there's 8 of them total, you want to include all 8, you're going to be writing a couple paragraphs describing them. So there's a couple different ways to do this. You'll notice that we have 2 pie charts for each site. Oops. So there's Punta Gorda and Punta Gorda over here. So recall that we have the regional data. So that's the area around the 15-mile diameter circle around the actual conservation site. And then we have the data for the actual conservation parcel. So you'll want to describe both of these in your description. Now you don't need to say exact percentages, okay? So this says agricultural area 1647 point blah, blah, blah. No, okay, you can just say that, the majority of the land, 88%, is agriculture. The rest is, what is this, lowland broadleaf forest. And yes, Neville, I have a cat howling in the background. Thank you. In the regional data, be quiet, cat. We have a little bit more diversity. Okay, so you can include that as well, but don't give specifics. Okay, so you don't need to say that 49% is lowland pine forest, whereas 42%. You know, you can just say approximately half of the area is lowland pine forest. Quite a bit is the lowland broadleaf forest, and then there is some additional mangroves and woodlands and water and so forth. Okay, so that should take a couple paragraphs describing all of the data there. All right, so let me go back to my PowerPoint. So you'll have a paragraph indicating the regional and parcel trends for each site. And when you do this, I suggest that you do the sites to the regional and parcel land for each site together. So have Punta Gorda regional and parcel trends, Coxcomb Basin regional and partial. That makes a little bit more sense than if you just did the regional data for all of the sites first and then the parcel trends for all of the data the second part. That just doesn't make sense when you're trying to figure out how to interpret this data. So I would include regional and parcel sites per site in that order. Okay, so that with the pie charts, that should take quite a bit of space. And then the final part of your results will include the diversity indices. Now remember, the diversity indices is that point count data that we took described in the methods section. So that's where we took basically all of the birds seen or heard and put it in an Excel spreadsheet, and then we uploaded that spreadsheet into that PATH software program to get our diversity indices. So those diversity indices, let me go ahead and pull those up. You'll need to include this table, okay? So you could do a screenshot just like I showed you and include that. So once you've included this table in your document, you're going to be describing them. And I suggest that you describe it by category. Don't describe it by site. Okay, that just doesn't make sense. Punta Gorda had 240 species, 185, blah, 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 and then go on. That just doesn't make sense. Instead, start out with taxa. First of all, what does taxa mean? That's the number of species. So based on that point count data, we had 240 species for both Punta Gorda and Coxcomb. We had 97, 96 for the other two. Number of individuals, that's simply the number of individuals spotted. So you can see Coxcomb had the most, Gallon Jug had the least. And then we have these three diversity indices. So these diversity indices, you're going to need to do a little research on. So I would start with chapter 16 of your textbook and look up what the Shannon Index measures. What does dominance and the equitability measure? So what does this mean if we see 0.004 versus 0.106? Okay, which is the better number here? So you're going to need to look that up. And so describe what the numbers trends are for these indices, and so what this indicates. And then same with the Shannon Index, and then same with the equitability. So you can see there's some differences for each of these based on the sites. So you don't want to interpret any data here, you're just basically stating the facts. Okay, so Punta Gorda had the lowest dominance index, the Gallon Jug had the highest at 0.1, which indicates that, well, you're going to have to look it up. Okay, so you'll include that chart and you will describe it. So when you do the paragraph, identify what each index describes and the trends in data that you see. Okay, so you can just say something like, you know, the most and the least. So for example, with that dominance index, you can describe what it indicates, and then you know, Gallon Jug had the highest dominance index and Punta Gorda had the lowest. And then reference the chart or the table. So just by looking at the results section there, you'll have 3 subheadings. Each of these subheadings will include paragraphs that are written out, as well as figures and tables. Okay. All right, so that's the results section. Notice we're not interpreting any data here. We're just describing trends in the data that we see. In the discussion section, that's where we're going to be identifying or interpreting the data. So let's take a closer look at that. So with the discussion, I like to divide it into 4 sections, just like, you know, any other section or heading, I tend to like subheadings. So this is how I recommend. So species diversity and abundance subheading, vegetation analysis subheading, and diversity indices subheading, and then a final recommendation subheading. So your discussion, you are going to be looking at the criteria that was involved in making your overall decision of which site to recommend. You'll be evaluating each site, and then you'll be coming up with a final recommendation. So that's the purpose of this discussion. So let's go by each of the sections. So let's start with the first one, species diversity and abundance. We'll need to identify the criteria and evaluate it. Then we'll do the same for vegetation analysis and so forth. So the first one, species diversity and abundance, you'll want to reference the graph and identify which site or sites have the highest diversity and why. Okay, so this is where you're actually interpreting it. So Punta Gorda and Coxcomb Basin have higher diversities than Belmopan and Gallon Jug. And you'll need to describe why you're stating that based on the information from the graph. So you can see there's an upward trend. They're continuing to find new species, even in Survey 15, something like that. And then so that'll take a couple of sentences to describe. And then which site would be in the running for recommendation based on this data alone. So remember back in our introduction, you needed to provide an explanation of which site you would choose. Okay, so was it the one that was the most diverse in species? Was it the one that had the most plant diversity? Was it a combination of both? You know, what were you thinking about in your final decision, like which one would you choose? So based on your introduction, you'll want to take a look, reread it, make sure you're on the right track for your final recommendation, and then figure out, just based on this data set alone, this graph, which one would you choose? Okay, so what would the final recommendation be just on this data alone? Okay. And I'll explain why that's necessary in a bit. Next, you have your vegetation analysis. So that's based on those pie charts. So based on the pie charts alone, you know, which one's going to be in the final running? Okay, so are you going to choose the sites with the highest diversity, the lowest diversity? Why would you choose one site over the other? Okay. So identify which sites have the highest diversity and why, and which site would be in the running for your final recommendation. So that might be different from what you chose for the species diversity and abundance graphs. Okay, so you can see why it's important to kind of narrow down your choices based on each data set alone. And then finally, we have our diversities indices. So reference those diversity indices, identifying which sites have the best numbers overall, and then which one you would recommend based on that particular data set alone. So by this point, you'll have probably 3 paragraphs, and you'll have maybe 3 different recommendations, or maybe, you know, you'll start seeing that there's one site that stands out more than the others. Okay, so that's based on those 3 different data sets. You've interpreted your data, and now you can come up with your final recommendation. So based on the 3 criteria, which site are you going to recommend and why? So when you're writing this paragraph, make sure you fully explain why you chose the site over the others. Okay, now based on, you know, looking at the graphs and the data, there's a couple sites that would be close, okay, where I would argue, you know, one might, you know, either would work. So why did you choose just one? Why did you choose this site over the other site that also did really well? So you need to be specific, okay? So that way, you know, if you're giving this to your client, they see these two sites, both of them look great. Well, why did you choose this one over that one? So you need to have a clear explanation. And then finally, in order to get exemplary in this category, according to the rubric, you need to identify future areas of research that could help solidify your recommendation and why. So remember, you might have a couple sites you're deciding on and you chose one site in the end. You can only choose one. They only have enough money to purchase one site. So maybe there's some areas of additional research that your foundation or your company can conduct to solidify that recommendation. Okay, so think about what would be a good future area of study and just briefly describe that. All right, so that should only take a sentence or two. So that's the discussion section. So it's all pretty much written out for you. Now, results in the discussion section, you're writing out, but you're also being graded on your reference section as well as your writing quality in this particular milestone. So there's actually 4 different categories that you're going to be graded on. So with your reference section, reminder, everything is in APA format. Okay, so we've been using APA format all term long, so make sure you continue doing that. The reference section that you're submitting in this milestone includes all of your references, not just the ones you used in milestone 3. Okay, you're being graded on this is basically for your final project, so all of the references that you have used in your paper. So that includes, anything that you used in the intro and the method section, etc. So you need to have a minimum of 2 sources. So that's to get a proficient score. If you have more than 2, then you can earn an exemplary score. So I suggest you go for 3 or more. All of you, every single student, should reference the ODEA article because you use that to describe your McKinnon methods, right, in your methods section. So there's one source right there that you need to include. The Merman data is another source because you need to give credit to the Merman data for the plant diversity data. Okay, we used their information, so you have to give them credit for that. So right there's 2 sources and you just need a minimum of 2. So we give them to you. Pretty simple. But again, if you want exemplary, you're going to need to come up with other sources. So remember the diversity indices, where you're going to have to look up and describe what the Shannon index is, what the dominance index is. You might use your textbook for that or another source. Well, there's your 3rd reference right there. Okay, and then any other sources that you may have used, include those. Now, sometimes students include our SNHU resources. Those are technically your resources that your company, your foundation collected. So you're not going to use any of the SNHU sources as a reference, okay? Because we're pretending you collected that data. The pie charts are your data, okay, that your company collected. The diversity indices table, that's what your company put together using that past software. So that is not included as a source. Okay, that's the actual data that was collected and analyzed. And any of these PowerPoint slides and things like that, you don't need to include either because I'm just explaining how to do this paper. So it's just the ODEA et al. Merman data, textbook, and any other sources outside of SNHU documentation. Okay, so that's the reference section. So I guess that's like 10 points of your grade. So make sure you don't forget to do that. And then finally, you're going to be graded on your writing style. So this includes the organization of your paper. So I recommend that you include those section headings in bold. Okay, so that would be the introduction, methods, results, discussion, references. So those are all included as section headings. You'll need to make sure this is in paragraph format. The complete paper will be paragraph format. There's no bullet points anywhere. This is an actual formal paper, so it does need to be in paragraph format. I noticed lately a lot of students are not indenting their paragraphs. So make sure you indent the first sentence of your paragraph so that in each of your paragraphs have that indent. So that's just standard writing skills right there. When you embed your figures in tables, you'll need to have figure and table legends. Okay, so this includes whether you're going to embed your graphs and charts within your actual paragraphs, or if you're going to include it as an appendix at the end of your paper. They need to include figure legends and tables, legends. So you'll need to look at that frontiers in the environment. That document actually has information about what to include in your figures and tables, legends. So typically with the figure, that would be a graph or the pie charts, those are considered figures. So you'll include a little figure legend at the bottom. So that would be just basically figure 1, and then you can describe what that figure is. And then a table would be, for example, the diversity indices table, that's a table. Or if you include the data table from the graph, those are considered tables. So you'll have table 1, table 2, however you want to write it, and a little description of the table. And table formatting, the table legend goes above the table. Figures, like the graphs and the pie charts, the figure legend goes below the figure. Okay, and feel free to ask questions about the formatting of that if you're still confused. But otherwise, just go into the O'Day et al. Article, look at those figures, and you can get an idea of what to include. And then double check, proofread, and spelling, check those grammatical errors. So if I do see some spelling errors or grammatical errors, I will knock you points for that. So it's always a good idea to read things out loud for grammatical errors so you can catch them. Or maybe even have a friend or a family member look over your paper and see if they can catch any of those errors for you. Citations. So you'll need to include citations where appropriate throughout your paper, and they need to be in APA format. So you should be very familiar with citations, in-text citations now after all of those discussions that you've been doing. So remember, the format is always author, comma, year, and they are in parentheses at the end of the sentence before the punctuation mark. So you might not include too many citations in particularly the results section. You probably won't have any. The discussion section you might, based on your final recommendation. But you'll definitely have those references in the introduction section. So make sure you know how to write those citations out. All right. And then finally, make sure that you're taking a look at the rubric. So let me go ahead and show you the rubric. Just make sure that we're all on the right page. So milestone 3, this is what I'm grading you on. Okay, so you have your results section, your discussion section, your literature cited section, and your writing section. So sometimes students leave out the literature cited, they just forget it. Well, there's 10 points right there that get knocked off. So make sure you include them. But the majority will be on the results and the discussion sections. Results section, if you take a look, it says species detection line graphs, mention the diversity indices, mention the vegetation part. So that's why I had those 3 subheadings. So you are including all of that information. For the discussion section, criteria used to evaluate the parcels, the evaluations themselves, and so forth. So that's why, I include that as subheadings for each of the data. But also over here in exemplary, it says additional investigation or research that would make better inform the rankings of your recommendation. So that's why I suggested including that information in the discussion section. Okay, so double check the rubric before you submit. Here's your literature cited section, more than 2 scholarly articles. So I gave you 2 of them. You need to find 1 more, okay? And then here's your information about the writing. So you have proper organization, grammar, style, citations. Okay? If you have any questions, feel free to go and write them in our discussion board in the general questions section, okay? Or you can simply just email me. Otherwise, you have until Sunday midnight, so make sure you get that in. And then the sooner you get it in, that way I'll grade it, give you my feedback hopefully by Monday or Tuesday morning. And then that will set you up for finalizing everything for your final project. So your final project is due next Sunday midnight, and that one is including all of the sections, intro, methods, results, and discussion sections, putting it all together in one final paper. And this is the big 400-point assignment. So that's why you want to get this, get the milestone 3 in, completed, and perfected, so that next week you can just simply put everything together, include any feedback that I provided, make your improvements, and then submit it for that 400 points at the end of next week. All right, so feel free to email me or set up a discussion board for any questions that you might have. All right, good luck everyone.